Welcome, ministry leaders, this special follow-up conversation on empowering church leaders to address racism, presented in partnership by NFCYM, USCCB, United States Catholic Mission Association, and the Catholic Mobilizing Network. I'm Michael Theisen, Director of Ministry Formation for NFCYM, and I'm pleased to be joined by 350 leaders from across the country as we continue this critical conversation in examining pastoral responses to racism in light of our Catholic faith. Before we go there, though, a moment of your time to go to webinar reminders. First, all your microphone connections have been muted. If you experience sound or viewing issues, it's usually connected to the quality of your internet connection. So if you have other programs running during this time, you may want to close out of them. If your webinar screen disappears, click on that GoToWebinar flower power icon in your menu bar. You can adjust the size of your screen as needed by clicking and dragging on the line between the camera view and the presentation screen. The webinar presentation will last about an hour, with questions and answer portion reserved toward the end. To ask a question or make a comment during the presentation, which we want you to do, please use the question box that appears in your GoToWebinar panel. Just type in your question or comment, click submit it, and we'll repost it so others can view it as well. This webinar is being recorded and everyone will receive an email within 3 hours after its completion with the link to the recording. Please feel free to share this link with your friends. There is a handout, perhaps 2 handouts, or there might be up to 2 handouts that you can download during the presentation. They're noted on the handout bar on your GoToWebinar panel. So check that and be sure to download. If you're watching by video recording, feel free to email me and I will be happy to send you those handouts. My email is MikeT, M-I-K-E-T, @nfcym.org. That's all for the announcements. Now it's time to start off in prayer. So if we could collect ourselves and remember the God who has called us into this ministry and into this work. And as we sign ourselves in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
I'm going to ask, here we are, and Danielle is going to lead us all.
Prayer to heal racial division. We thank you, O Lord, for in your loving wisdom, you created one human family with a diversity that enriches our communities.
We pray to you, O Lord, that we always recognize each member of this human family as being made in your image and beloved by you, with worth and dignity.
We pray to you, O Lord, that we may envision a way forward to heal the racial divisions that deny human dignity and the bonds between all human beings.
We pray to you, O Lord, that we may affirm each person's dignity through fair access for all to economic opportunity, housing, education, and employment.
We pray to you, O Lord, that we may have eyes to see what is possible when we reach out beyond fear, beyond anger, to hold the hand of our sisters and brothers.
And we thank you, O Lord, for your call and challenge to us, that we may reveal your teachings and your love through our actions to end racism and to proclaim that we are all your children, heirs to your sacred creation. Amen.
Amen.
And to get us started in this important conversation, I invite Danielle Brown to lead us off.
Thank you so much. My name is Danielle Brown, and I am the Associate Director of the Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism here at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. At the prior webinar, there were several questions that came in the wake of and during the webinar regarding several terms and terminology that are prevalent to the conversation that we are having in racism. And so we've undertaken the task of defining several of them. I will start out with the definition of racism that can be found in Open Wide Our Hearts, the Enduring Call to Love, the pastoral letter against racism. Racism, as defined by the bishops, arises when either consciously or unconsciously a person holds that their own race or ethnicity is superior and then judges other people, other races and ethnicities as inferior or of unequal worth. And some of the conversation surrounding this particular definition has to do with the negation of, or the absence of, the definition that racism is racial prejudice plus power, which is found in a lot of sociological framework for the discussion of racism. And what I recall and what I think the bishops are conveying through their definition, which is up on your screen there, is that they are not sociologists, they're theologians. And so this is the theological stance with which they are coming to the conversation. And secondly, the bishops do get into the concept of structural racism. And if you look at the fourth bullet point on the slide, you'll see their definition of how that comes about. And the bishops really highlight that structural racism and systematic racism is the product of an individual propensity to be racist, and the fact that we cannot attack structural or systematic racism without first dealing with it as it resides in a person. Next up, we have, I think, the term prejudice. And if that slide can come up. So prejudice is not actually defined by the bishops in the pastoral letter, but it is injury or damage of another person, a preconceived judgment or opinion. And now I'll toss it over for the next definition.
Sure.
Donna.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Danielle. So the next term that we wanted to talk about was colorism. Colorism is prejudice or discrimination against an individual because of their skin tone or their physical appearance, hair, eye color, and it's typically common within a particular group, but it can also be exterior as well. And often what this translates to is very practically sort of looking down or looking at someone because of darker features. This often is reflected internally within a community as sort of whiter is better, or an understanding that the preference for beauty is to be lighter. We've had a number of instances in popular culture where people have gone out of their way to whiten themselves or whiten their skin color because within a group, white is considered more beautiful. And so it often affects the way that they're seen within their status within a community. It often can have effects on how they view themselves personally. So it can create issues around self-worth and self-identity. And so this is an issue that is really important to unpack, especially when we're talking about how racism can end up affecting individuals, because it very much can sort of take away their sense of self-worth and sort of a desire to look different, to be able to fit in or be more considered more beautiful by the popular culture. Don?
One of my tasks is to address some of these issues that were raised in the last webinar. And there are several concepts: white supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility. And just wanted to take a moment to unpack those. White supremacy is really an ideology which believes that white people are superior and therefore they should rule. So my image for that would be George Wallace. For some of us who are old enough, we remember him when he was governor, and he actually ran for president, and he firmly believed in segregation, believed that white people were superior to people of color. The second concept is white privilege. And the emphasis there is not on an ideology. It's a little bit softer, if you will, but maybe more pervasive. And that's that idea that we have advantages as white people relative to people of color. And the image that I have for that is a scene from the movie The Help, where you simply have people assuming because they are white, they don't do certain things and they do certain things. So it's just we just have a privilege. So because I'm white, you should, attend to me first, or you should stop talking and listen to what I have to say. That sense of advantage, just that nebulous sense of advantage, that's just part of the atmosphere that we live in. That's what white privilege is talking about. And then the third concept is white fragility. And that concept is that we have that when we start talking about race, we just immediately start entering into some type of stressful conversation. And our brothers and sisters who are African American or Native American, Hispanic, they live with this kind of stress. They know it up close and personal. They've been raised with it since very early childhood. As white folks, we haven't been. And so when just the question of race comes up, it's very easy for us to simply, get stressed about it. And that's what white fragility is trying to talk about. And I actually saw some of that in Vice President Biden during his first debate, where he was kind of unnerved when Senator Harris brought up the question of racism. So it's just that uncomfortableness, and there's kind of a thin skin to it. So those are three images of white supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility.
Systemic racism. Many struggle with this concept. We're very, well conditioned to individual behaviors and words that appear to be racist, but we're less clear sometimes on what systemic racism is. And this is how it's defined. Systemic racism is racial injustice as it operates on the institutional level, as it's embedded within systems, within our social systems, such as the healthcare system, criminal justice system, education, and banking, especially in terms of, and with banking, especially in terms of obtaining mortgages and business financing. Racial disparities like this iceberg may be observable, parts of it are observable, but often those disparities are hidden below the surface. And they're hidden in procedures and laws, practices, common practices that take place within institutions. And two quick examples that I think are pretty self-explanatory in terms of systemic racism are the Flint water crisis in Michigan, how people were poisoned by by decisions that were made. Not that illegal actions were taken, but perfectly legal actions were taken, but they had an adverse effect and still have an adverse effect on those communities. And another example is the National Housing Act of 1934, which really discriminated against African Americans and others on the basis on racial bases. And they some of those practices included dismantling integrated public housing, and there was a real effort to do that. There, we don't see that image too much anymore, but the government came in and said, we're going to tear these housing units down and build other ones that really separate people by race. And the other clearly would be redlining, deciding that certain neighborhoods are not safe and therefore not valued. Homeowners could not accrue assets and those kind of things. So that's what systemic racism is about. The reparation is often seen as a lightning rod political issue, but for us as Catholics, it's a concept we already embrace, and we have been embracing, at least sacramentally. And this is what reparation is. and we should be familiar with these words if we go to confession on a regular basis. My God, I am sorry for my sins with all my heart. In choosing to do wrong and failing to do good, I have sinned against you, whom I should love above all things. And here's where reparation comes in. I firmly intend, with your help, to do penance, to sin no more, and to avoid whatever leads me to sin. And this is what reparation is about: making amends, acknowledging the sin, whatever it is, naming that sin. And in this case, we're talking about racism, and making amends, not to do, and then promising not to do that, not to sin anymore. Right? Another term we wanted to break down for you. Oh, Don will tell you about this one.
Is implicit bias. So implicit bias really is just unconscious bias. It's when a person sees somebody and something about that person, about the other person, jumps out at the observer, and the observer forms opinions based on those attributes that they perceive, and those attributes aren't always correct. Perceiving that, you know, somebody may be a person of color and they may be in fact Eastern European. So it doesn't mean that those perceptions are correct, but it's when you act negatively towards a person based upon your perceptions. Underneath that short definition, I just have a quick screenshot of the Catholic Health Association, which actually does some online learning on mitigating the negative effects of unconscious bias, which is, if you've been at all privy to it in the news, a very, very prevalent topic for healthcare workers, in that particularly when it comes to maternal health, women of color are desperately impacted. Next slide.
Enculturation it's a theological term. You've heard of, well, enculturation is a theological term, and what it speaks to is engaging with the scriptures and holy scripture and our sacred tradition, especially the gospel, in ways that help people to understand and receive the good news. So it involves dialogue, if you will, cultural dialogue, and of course the grace of the Holy Spirit to impart that message. Enculturation, it also means enculturation, evangelization of cultures. So I use this picture as an example. This is an example, an image that catechists used in Cameroon to tell the story of Jesus welcoming the children, and the kingdom of heaven is like this. So people to accept the gospel, it needs to resonate for them with their culture, with their stories of origin, with their the values of the culture, and enculturation is expressed in a lot of different ways, through art, through music, through gestures, and through those cultural markers that are unspoken but are well understood within a group of people. That's enculturation.
Next up, I want to talk about the listening sessions that the bishops have been conducting across the United States since this past fall. The USUCB Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism has been established since November of 2017. In 2018, we began holding listening sessions in several cities across the United States. In 2018, in Florida, St. Petersburg Diocese, also St. Louis Diocese, and you can see the list of the listening sessions that have occurred thus far this year. And the listening sessions are an opportunity for the bishops to come together with their congregants and also with members of the Ad Hoc Committee Against Racism to explore the ways that race or racism or racist systems within the church, and in some cases outside of the church, have affected the congregation. What I've seen as I've gone to each of these is that they can be really transformational. And so I want to hold these out as one concrete example of the way that the bishops are really engaging the faithful and helping bishops on a local level engage those who have been harmed by racism. And so not only is it an opportunity to, in a way, tell the bishop how wrong they may have been by somebody in the diocese, or an impactful policy that has been negative in their lives, but the congregants and the participants are also really able to be heard. And I've seen healing happen in front of my face as people tell their stories and receive not only the reception of the crowd, but the reception of their bishops, and affirmation of the truths that have been coloring their experiences, for lack of a better word, and no pun intended, within the Catholic Church in America. So this can be a real touch point for healing at the diocesan level, and we have several more that will come this year. If you out there are interested in having a listening session, do contact your diocesan lead on multicultural affairs. If you are that person, feel free to contact me at the end of this webinar. Just real quick, the picture that you're looking at right now, that past picture was a picture of the Diocese of Arlington at their listening session.
Thanks, Danielle. What I want to share here is about using a restorative justice lens and enlisting practices, restorative justice practices, to engage in racial healing. This is a picture of the book. It was mentioned on the first webinar. Catholic Mobilizing Network just published this book with Liturgical Press. It's called Harm, Healing, and Human Dignity. It's a Catholic encounter with restorative justice. So if you're interested in learning about restorative justice and its perspective, its way, its approach, the philosophy behind it, but more importantly, how Catholics can come to this as part of their faith, a practice of their faith, and engage in their faith more holistically through using restorative practices. I just wanted to share that. I also want to say that in understanding racism is critical for any justice issues that we face here in the United States, and that certainly holds true for Catholic Mobilizing and our work with ending the death penalty and promoting restorative justice. Certainly when we see issues of mass incarceration and the tip of the iceberg with the death penalty, disproportionate use of this practice against people of color is something that we confront every day. So we're very excited to be in this conversation and to be with you all in this dialogue. And thank you all for tuning in today. To do that with us. So again, a definition about what restorative justice is. It's a way of understanding harm, crime, and wrongdoing in terms of the people and relationships. That is the critical word here. It's the relationships that are harmed and impacted, rather than focusing on a law that has been broken. This is very much different, or a departure from the way we think about our criminal legal system. So that is restorative justice, and it doesn't just have to do with criminal justice. It has to do with any kind of harm and wrongdoing, and the relationship fractures that have happened because of the prevalence of racism is critical. So using restorative approach and philosophy and practices to address racial justice is critical. So this is just a comparison of what the criminal legal justice sort of perspective is, and the comparison of what restorative justice perspective is. They ask very different questions from one another. Retributive justice is often thought to, how do we focus on the offender, and what punishment do we dole out to sort of provide some kind of solution? So it asks what law has been broken, who did it, and what do they deserve? If this is kind of a philosophy of deterring crime because you're targeting an offender. Very much different than looking at restorative justice. It's an alternative to retributive justice that asks about focuses on the relationships and the relationships that were fractured and broken. So who has been harmed, who has been impacted, and who has a role to play in repairing the harm? Very different questions. I guess I want to just share a little bit about restorative circle practices. Sometimes they are called peacekeeping circles. Sometimes they're called just circle process or healing circles. It's a core practice within restorative justice. It sort of levels the playing field. In victim offender situations, in crime situations, it can actually be a highly organized and prepared for mediation between all parties, but it also can be used just to have hard conversations and to bring people together to take off the many masks that we wear so we can have more authentic encounters with one another and deeper conversations. So you see a picture here of an actual circle that Catholic Mobilizing brought together a few months ago. It was a circle intensive. So you see the sense that folks are actually sitting together in a circle. People are face to face. There's a circle keeper in the circle, and this is someone who is involved in helping contain the conversation. They're helping to create a safe space, or at least a comfortable space to have what is often difficult conversations. The circle is round and everyone's sitting at the same level, so you're kind of leveling the playing field so that no one person has more power than the next. And again, that's what the circle keeper is helping to do, just be that great equalizer. There's often a talking piece that goes around in the circle. So this is not dialogical. You're not having a conversation. No one is speaking as in terms of reacting to what somebody else is saying. They're asked the same question all around the circle, and then people speak from their experience. And that's so critical in dealing with issues of race, because we all have some concept of race, some concept of racial division. We all bring a different experience to that story. We all have our own race and our own kind of background in terms of our own traditions or our own cultures. So how do we bring that and speak with that truth about who we are before a group? And if we all do that, what happens is that container, that circle, begins to hold a space that just allows for this deeper exchange, this encounter with one another. So if you have the talking piece, you are having the conversation. You're sharing. I shouldn't say you're having the conversation, because it's really just you sharing your perspective, and then you would pass it along to the next person. A talking piece is often, a small object, maybe a small statue, or maybe a stone, or maybe it's a branch, maybe it's a stick. It can be many things, but the talking piece measures the person having the conversation and then to the next. As you'll see in the picture there's a centerpiece. So a centerpiece is really important. It's often a cloth. There's often something living in the middle of the circle. It shows that organic, natural presence. There's also little pieces, little trinkets that sometimes the circle keeper will ask the participants to bring, where they kind of share something into the circle so it becomes a communal center. So the centerpiece maybe has a candle in it, again, maybe a cross. This is central and kind of core to what circles look like. And then to begin and end the circle, there's often a ceremony, so that there's an entering into this sacred space and then a departure from the sacred space, so that you can kind of, demarcate when we're having this sacred conversation, and then we're stepping out and maybe having more normal conversations, actually maybe having a conversation, as opposed to people just speaking from their own experience. So this is something you'll often see referred to. It's a powerful way to listen and to lean in. It slows down the conversation, again, for that encounter. So that's core to restorative justice. A little bit later, I think we're all going to share to some degree, books that we've been reading about racial justice. And I did want to share one book that I have been spending some time with. It's at the intersection of racial justice and restorative justice. It's called The Little Book of Racial Healing, Coming to the Table for Truth-Telling, Liberation and Transformation. It's written by an African-American woman and a Caucasian male, and they brought together 24 former slave owner sort of descendants and former slaves, and they created a conversation, a circle, and had a process at Eastern Mennonite University. So it's compelling in terms of the history and what they did to bring these groups together and the learnings that came from it. But they have some things to say about how folks like you and me, how we can engage in issues of racial justice. Core to their tenets in the book are, uncovering a history. We need to uncover history between each other to understand who we are together, to share our histories of race, our communities, our families in ways that make sense and that speak to who we are. We need to make connections across racial lines. That needs to happen so that we can begin to break down these silos. And then we need to work towards healing. We all are needed in the process of transformation to move toward healing and toward racial justice. It's important that we all engage. So there's work to do, and there's no cookie cutter approach, but we know we just have to lean in and start. And then we have to take action with an eye towards systematic, institutional, structural, and individual racism, because it presents itself in a myriad of ways. So here is a slide that I liked from the book. It talks about addressing racism, some steps for white people, and the next slide here, addressing racism for people of color. We all have kind of roles to play and how we can engage, and I thought these were helpful slides to just take a moment with them and think, how am I doing? And lastly, we just wanted to share if circles are something that you're interested in, if restorative justice is something you're interested, certainly the book's a great primer, and it's a faith formation guide that's a smaller variation on a larger, deeply theological, philosophical text that has restorative justice and Catholic social teaching called Redemption and Restoration. So those two texts are a great place to start. But if you want to learn more about maybe doing circles where you are in the ministry that you're engaged in, you can visit our website where we have a circle trainer page. So people from all over the country who have a history of working in the Catholic community or in faith communities and kind of know our context, that's a good place to start. It's not, we don't have people everywhere in every city, but we have a number of people, and it's a good place to start, and they're good resources that have for us been recommended. The second is Restorative Justice Circle Intensive. So this is if you need a deeper primer, you really think, this is something I want to learn about more, I want to spend more time with it. We have a full day and a little bit of another day in Tallahassee. We've done several of these around the country, but our next is in September in Tallahassee, Florida. And then lastly, we have a Restorative Justice Circle Keeper training, which is, that's a deeper dive. If you are, an advocate for restorative justice and you want to dive in and invest in this and learn about doing circles and kind of being trained in an asset like that and a resource for your community, this is a wonderful training for you. It's going to be really low cost. We're working with Precious Blood Ministries of Reconciliation, Father David Kelly, and others in the south side of Chicago. They're great partners, lots of history in doing restorative circles. So that's happening in October, and you're more than welcome to join us. So thank you.
Okay, good. Cultural competencies. Intercultural competency basically is a set of skills that are really needed. It's the capacity to really be able to communicate and work together effectively. And how do we do that? We need to have, cultivate within ourselves certain knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And these are just a few examples. You know, an attitude of openness toward others, an attitude of curiosity and interest and respect, skills that we can, you know, we can bring to our relationships with others, the ability to speak another language, the ability to see, to listen well, to see another perspective. Those are some of the basic components. So we're talking about cultural competencies, but the idea here is that this is applicable also as we deal with racial justice, because we're coming with our own perspective and seeing the world through our own lens and our own experiences. But how do we broaden that lens? How do we open ourselves to really be able to kind of sometimes get over ourselves, our own limitations, to start to see each other as true brothers and sisters? And it's an ongoing process. So our office, Secretary of Cultural Diversity in the church, does offer training in cultural competency. We called it Building Intercultural Competence for Ministers. And it's really focused on, particularly on people working in the church in pastoral ministry, but it's applicable to other organizations as well. And we take we spend a lot of time looking at cultural competencies there in that program.
Thanks, Donna. I just noticed that there's not been any questions posted in the chat room, and I just wanted to remind people that that is an option, that you could post questions in the chat room. Or perhaps I haven't seen them. I'm looking at Darius and say, oh, yeah. So there's questions there. Just wanted to encourage people to use the chat room. I'd like to share just a little bit about reconciliation. Now, this understanding of reconciliation comes out of the mission perspective. And one way of thinking about reconciliation is really it's the accompaniment and hospitality to those seeking reconciliation in their own lives and in their communities. So the first thing is that, you know, this notion of reconciliation is really best to be appropriated by a community, so that you would try and cultivate within your community maybe a sub-community or a group that really wants to be a community of reconciliation, so that there's someone there that can really embrace that. Reconciliation is first and foremost a spirituality. So there's a formation that's involved with this, because it's a long walk. It's a long journey. Reconciliation is a long journey. There's no magical program or text that's going to resolve everything. So you need to be really grounded. Robert Schreider says that reconciliation really is first and foremost a spirituality, and secondarily a set of strategies. So that's the second part of that. There is a discernment piece that's involved. The mission and ministry of reconciliation always begins with the victims. So you need to know who the victims are. Who are you talking about? Who has suffered this injustice? And there's also a question of timing. Again, Schreider develops this more in his book, but there's kind of three phases to it. One is kind of the turbulent time, or the beginning, the genesis of reconciliation. Second is the transformation, and the third is the readjustment. So if you think of, you know, the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? You know, there was a lot going on before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that was a turbulent time. But then the wall came down, and that's kind of that was kind of a very powerful moment, which really shifted the whole thing into this period of transformation. And then there's the readjustment, and it's really in the time of readjustment when a lot of reconciliation can be done. Because that's where people are owning the history that they have, but they're trying to envision a new future for the community. So that's the Genesis 3 phases. So you kind of need to have a sense of where we're at. The other thing, of course, is that you need to really be clear about who the actors are. And there are obviously 8 different subgroups that you could point to. Victims and survivors, the wrongdoers themselves, bystanders, victims and wrongdoers. So you may have, for example, in some of the conflicts that we've seen, where you have very young people who've been recruited as, military folks. They themselves have been victimized, and yet they're also perpetuating these violent acts. So you have that kind of a situation where a person is both victim and wrongdoer. We also have to be mindful of our beloved dead, the stories that they have and what they have suffered and what they, because that continues to have an impact on us. Clearly future generations. I think the Native Americans, and I'm hesitant here because one of the things I've just become aware of is that some Native Americans don't like the term Native Americans. So again, it's a question of language. Some would prefer to be called American Indians. Others would prefer to be called Navajo. I mean, so there's a question of language. And again, that really becomes a question of culture and question of dominance. And so I might presume that me as a white person, that I can decide what language to use. Well, that's no longer true. We need to be sensitive to that. But out of that tradition, they have the idea of 7 generations. Are we envisioning the world in 7 generations down the road? We are the product of the last 7 generations, and we are the parents of the next 7 generations. And clearly, neighbors. A good example of this would be, the struggle of Native Americans in this country. Their neighbors, if you will, in that struggle would be the Hispanic people that have come into this, the Hispanic immigrants. And again, there's another word, right? Hispanic. Some people don't like that word. They prefer Latino or Latinx or those kind of things. So the question is hence. And then others, people struggling for a racial African American and white reconciliation in some of our inner cities. Those would be neighbors. They're not directly related to the struggle of the Native Americans, but they are neighbors to that. And of course, God, that God is an actor, if you will, in all of this. In church, what we do is we have this remarkable message, which is that reconciliation is possible. That's not an evolutionary perspective. Only the strong survive, right? And we're saying no, we have a different perspective. Reconciliation is possible. And we have rituals that will help facilitate that. And we can create communities of reconciliation to help communicate that. So those are some aspects of reconciliation. If you could go to the next slide, Darius, I kind of wanted to give an image to you about this. Georgetown University has taken responsibility for its participation in slavery. And there's a whole website up about this work that they've done. The Jesuits, and it's not just Georgetown University, this is a sin that the entire Jesuit community takes responsibility for, had slaves, owned slaves, sold slaves. And so you can learn more about this at this website. The university has created an institute on racial justice, and so they really are trying to work at this in some remarkable ways. And one of the things that really moved me is that the university has now recognized the descendants of all of the slaves that participated in the building of Georgetown University, have recognized them as alums to the university, which means that if those descendants apply to the university, they would be treated as offsprings of alums. The other thing that the students are working on is they're working on, so 272. So they're looking at adding a fee, $27.20. I don't know if it's a semester or a year or whatever, but that money that recognizes this 272 slaves that Georgetown had, that would go into a fund that then could be used to support the descendants of slaves. So again, that's a way of beginning to think about reparation in some ways. And then the last slide, we're kind of trying to look at this ourselves. Reconciliation is kind of the theme that USCMA has had for the year, and we've done a number of things, and clearly participating in this webinar is one of them. But we do want to do a deep dive on the question of reconciliation. We're going to be using Schroeder's book, and so in September we're going to have a 4-part series. And so if you're interested in that, simply let me know, and we'll be sure that you're invited to join that. There's scriptural roots, and spirituality, again, is really important. Strategies, and as Krisanne was saying so well as Danielle and Donna and Darius, there are skills that are involved that we can develop. The ability to listen, the ability to hold some tension within a group, those kind of questions are really helpful. And we're trying to explore that in this series of webinars, this 4-part series, this 4-part webinar in September.
Thank you so much, Don. So as we kind of wrap up our part of the panel and our experience, we really wanted to highlight some resources that we would like to really recommend from our own experience that are helping us as we're engaging in these conversations around race, around racism and prejudice, and really understand that we are all called in this church, particularly through the pastoral letter, to engage in these conversations, understanding that this is not just a political issue, this is not a societal issue, this is a spiritual issue. This is something that we are called as church, as Christians, to engage in. And I want to highlight in particular the importance of engaging young people in these conversations. So many of our young people are very aware through social media, through their own experiences, through the diverse reality of their generation, that racism really very much exists, and it's very much a part of their everyday lives. It's something that they're exposed to through the culture, through social media, through chat rooms, through Twitter. You don't have to go far to see examples of this playing out in real life. And so all of us as ministers, whether we work directly with young people or not, are really invited to make this as a priority, because this is so prevalent within our culture, especially here in the United States. We have a very distinct and different history than other countries when it comes to race relations, when it comes to cultural realities, and we are so diverse. And so we really need to invite all of our brothers and sisters, all of those that we serve, but especially young people, because it's so present in the forefront of their minds, into this dialogue and conversation. I wanted to highlight a couple of resources that I have found particularly helpful in my work. One great resource, especially if you're working with young people, is from St. Mary's Press. They have an online course called Understanding Racism. They have a number of lessons that go through different aspects of racism and really break this open. This is appropriate for high schoolers, but you could also use it with middle schoolers, or even some younger, younger version of young adults as well, kind of that college age group. But it really breaks down as a resource and tool how to engage in these conversations, defining what racism is, understanding the realities of what it is, and it really helps young people from a faith perspective engage in just some really intentional and new ways. It's a really wonderful online resource. You can actually test the lessons out for free at St. Mary's Press's website. We'll be sure to add that into the resource handout that's part of the follow-up. But it's something that I highly recommend, and something that I know St. Mary's Press has been very intentional about wanting to work with the USCCB and having this resource available in relationship to the pastoral letter. Another one, Donna spoke a lot about intercultural competency. I'm rereading this book, The Wolf Shall Dwell with the Lamb by Eric Law. It's really something that I think is important for any minister to work with. And if you don't think of yourself as working in a multicultural community right now, recognize that the way that the face of the church is changing demographically, all of us are going to be called to engage and work with people of other cultures. For those who work particularly in the Northeast and the Midwest, as many parish demographics change, as more parishes are being combined or consolidated for lots of different reasons, I think we need to be aware of our responsibility as pastoral ministers to be interculturally competent and to engage in that. And this is a great entry point for really understanding the spirituality of our leadership and working in diverse settings. It really helps to talk about power, and how power plays itself out in different cultural contexts. It talks about the stance that we have to come into in working with different cultures, especially those that are different than our own. And it's just a really wonderful place to start engaging your own reality of how to serve in different cultural groups and in different cultural settings. So whether you work in a parish, you work in a school, you work in social justice ministry, all of us, I think, are called to be better stewards and better extensions of the gospel in different cultural settings. And so I think this is a great starting place to do that. Don, do you want to go next?
Thank you. Yeah, just a few suggestions, and this is actually kind of chronological. There's a documentary. It's called The 13th, and it's about the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, and it really shows how people went, the racism, if you will, within this country went from slavery into criminalization. So it's almost as if it's a crime to be a person of color in this country. And so when you're talking about systematic or systemic racism, this documentary nails it. So, I mean, I would just encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't done so. The other thing that I have found very moving is the story of White Lies. White Lies is a podcast. It's by National Public Radio, and it is the two white journalists from Alabama, actually, descendants, if you will, of slave owners, have investigated the death of Reverend Reeb, R-E-E-B. He was a white minister, Unitarian minister, who came to Selma to support Dr. Martin Luther King in the March on Selma, on the March for Civil Rights, and he was murdered. And it's the story of how this story was shaped and framed by the community because they could not look at the truth of their own racism, their own sinfulness. And so you get a sense of how easy it is for this stuff to just kind of take on its own narrative and how that narrative shapes people's lives down to generations. The last issue talks about the impact that all of this had 50 years later on the children and the grandchildren of these people that were involved in this incident in 1965. And then finally, Robin DiAngelo is really tackling the question of white fragility. And that experience, that sense of white fragility, has grown out of her efforts with others to do kind of an awareness workshop on the question of racism. And so she's looked at this, she's noticed it through these workshops, and then she did sociological studies on these kind of questions. And this text spells out what it is and how it shows up in a variety of ways. So those are a few things that I'm, well, the white fragility is the one that I'm really reading right now. So it's just, I think these are really helpful ways of kind of becoming more self-aware of how racism can so easily impact our lives.
Well, I want to take a moment to just again thank the panel, Don, Krisanne, Donna, Danielle. You guys have done such a wonderful job of really addressing some of the big issues that came from that initial webinar, and the questions we had were so great. The feedback that we received was really wonderful. I want to actually get to some of the questions that we received so far. We have a few more minutes, and I really want to engage in some of the dialogue that has been happening in the questions and chats. So a couple of helpful questions. I want to start with a kind of a very practical and basic one. Anne asked, how can this subject be introduced to a diocese which does not appear to have any interest in doing so? Danielle, I know you've been working with a number of dioceses to engage in this conversation. What do you recommend for somebody who wants to start this conversation but really hasn't seen any response from their diocesan office so far?
Sure. I mean, I suppose it would sort of depend on the person in terms of the tactic you would take, of course. But I would first really, really recommend prayer and serious prayer. And in these situations, it can help to have a prayer partner so that you can, bounce what you think that the Holy Spirit may be telling you in prayer off that person and then proceed. In terms of actually sort of hitting the ground and approaching the diocese, I would probably spend some time on the diocesan website and see what offices there are in your diocese first, if you don't know. And then you can sometimes deduce who might be more prone to take up an issue related to race in your diocese from the diocesan website. So oftentimes, the diocesan offices that we've been working with to plan the listening sessions on racism have been the Social Justice Office, the Justice and Peace Office. There have been several conglomerations of offices that are Justice and Peace and Human Dignity of Life offices have all been amenable, as well as the Diocesan Affinity offices, African American Affairs, Hispanic American Affairs, and so on. So it kind of just depends on who's in your office, but I would say try to stay as positive as possible, and try not to assume that because you haven't seen programming on a topic doesn't mean that that people don't want to do one. The other thing, last thing I'll say on this, is that diocesan workers are stretched to the max. And so part of the reason why, a lot of the diocesan folks that I've talked to haven't done it so far is because they simply don't have the bandwidth. And so if you're able to get a meeting with somebody who is more prone to do the program and say, hey, I'd be happy to do most of the legwork, you'd have an instant partner. So those are some hints that might help you out.
If I could just add to that question, I think it's a very good one about engaging a diocese, and especially if sometimes we're the change makers. So asking the question encourages this to become more of a priority for a diocese. But I wouldn't want to limit it to simply the diocese. If somebody wants to start local at their parish through an appropriate ministry or committee, certainly talking to the pastor and seeing if there's a willing ear. And then if there's a time of the liturgical year that something can be brought forward. We happen to do a Lenten series at my parish on Capitol Hill that isn't tremendously diverse, but we teamed up with a historically African-American church here in the city as part of the Lenten series, and had a speaker, had the pastor come. So we had a wonderful exchange. We did a Stations of the Cross on racism. And so we did something small in our own parish, and then that helps to lift up the issue, and it encourages others to join in. And that means not just folks within the parish, sometimes it means, neighboring parishes, and then you can begin to build a momentum yourself. And then perhaps the diocese even becomes more interesting, but it's encouraging you all to take action and lead where you're standing, because that's, sometimes where God's calling you to just bloom where you're planted and start this conversation right there.
And just to build on what both Danielle and Krisanne, other institutions, there's, like, for example, the University of Dayton is doing some work in the area of racism. Other Catholic colleges and universities, they might be already doing some stuff in this area. Catholic charities, Catholic hospitals, these other institutions might already be wrestling with these kind of questions. And again, there's maybe religious communities that are in your diocese that are also wrestling with with these kind of questions. So you may have more allies within the diocese than simply looking to the diocesan office.
Mhm.
Those are all great points. I want to ask this question to the whole panel because I think there might be a couple of different responses to this, but we talked about implicit bias and microaggressions. And the question Lisa asked was, she's curious to hear if these things fit into all three definitions of what we mentioned of white supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility. And maybe if you have any examples of what that actually looks like.
You know, it seems to me like microaggressions are notoriously hard to explain, and they're kind of, it's kind of one of the catchphrases in the racism arena right now. But I think it could be boiled down to some sort of action that somebody receives in their normal course of life that conveys to them some sort of subtle, desperate treatment. And the perception is almost always that it's based on race. So that's what a microaggression is. And I think that microaggressions, whether you're the giver or the receiver, really come from a root of implicit bias where people don't realize that they have some sort of bias and they're just reacting. And therefore it turns into a microaggression, which is sort of like the natural outflow of an implicit bias. So you have the implicit bias in your head, and then you let it out through your actions. That becomes a microaggression, and people experience it in that way. So that's kind of how I would explain it. A definition might be a situation where the one that I experience it most often in my life as a woman of color is I'm standing in line and I'm waiting for service. And I can't tell you how many times, you know, a person who apparently is European American comes up and just sort of steps in front of me and or speaks up before I do when I'm clearly the next person. But for some reason they just decide that I'm not worth the order in which I arrive to the desk.
And a lot of times microaggressions come out in things people say, not just what they do. So it's becoming very common for people to say, well, what are you? Meaning, what's your race? Where are you from? Or even asking you, where are you from? And if you say, oh, I'm from Washington, D.C. No, where are you really from? Where's your family from? And those kind of things. If you look anywhere ambiguous racially, people are trying to figure you out and trying to pigeonhole you. So it comes out in a lot of different ways. But I think I'm finding it comes out a lot in the way people speak. And again, it's not intentional. It's not intended to malign somebody, but there's a curiosity there, and people just don't know. They want to put you in, kind of put people in a box. So the inability to catch a cab when you're coming from the airport, you know, that's been very difficult. I live in Washington, D.C., and I live in Southwest Washington, and I've had to the cab folks have to say, oh, she's going to Capitol Hill, so I can get a ride, you know, because of concerns. So, you know, those are just examples of microaggressions. Or, you know, you go into a bank and people assume that you don't have the assets for to buy a home or whatever. You know, that there are assumptions made, and it doesn't just happen to African Americans. It happens to a lot of people as well. You know, a lot of Asians who have the money in their accounts, but not necessarily, but because they are self-employed, you know, there are different assumptions made that they and many times overlooked and feel invisible as a result. And in our parishes, we do this to people as well. That's one of the biggest complaints of Asian Pacific Islanders, is that they feel invisible in their parishes and in their communities. People expect them to be the model, a model minority, which is not. So it's not always a negative thing. It's like, oh, but they're hardworking and they're good in science and they're good, you know. So sometimes there's a romanticism about certain people that is those are microaggressions as well. You're tall, so you got to be able to play basketball, whatever, you know.
one of the things I wanted to mention, when it comes to white supremacy, there's nothing micro about it. I mean, white supremacy is I mean, and the bishops actually address this in the pastoral letter. I mean, it is a kind of a sinful attitude, because it just denies the dignity of another person, because we're better and therefore we should rule you. And so there's nothing micro about white supremacy. The other things, though, I mean, I think it is really a matter of just becoming really sensitive. And for myself, for me, it's mostly, am I becoming aware of these things within me? And do I have the courage to help another person see their own microaggression? So like Danielle said, you know, a white person stepping in front of me in line. Well, if I'm also in line, do I have the courage to say, excuse me, sir, but she was first? You know, and I find myself doing that all the time in grocery lines. You know, okay, he's first, she's second, I'm third, and he's fourth. You know, I mean,
Right.
just to kind of keep, you know, because it's so easy when it's not clear for someone simply to assume, well, I'm going to go next, type thing. And the last thing is, one of my friends called me on this. Now, it wasn't really race. This was a gender issue. But sometimes I refer. I mean, I frequently, when I'm writing to my members, I refer to Nicole. Nicole is our office manager. Well, not using Nicole's last name is a microaggression. You know, I mean, she's a professional, so it should be Nicole Petty, not Nicole. And you know, so I was embarrassed, but I've also been, my consciousness has been raised. So those are kinds of examples of microaggressions.
I want to raise a couple of comments or questions that have come up in regards to specifically white privilege. We've had a couple of definitions that were shared in the question section. They asked for a response from the panel on this definition. White privilege is never having to question that you're privileged. Another definition that was given is the ability at any time to walk away. From your own experiences or from your own understanding, how would you respond to those definitions of white privilege? Maybe how would you define that yourselves?
I would say both of those are valid. I mean, you can turn it on and off. You don't have to deal with it. It's like you don't have to deal with racial issues, you know. And the standard in the U.S. is white is the standard. And so it's the yardstick against which others are measured. So, and I think it's coming into play a lot more too as people start to challenge. Well, how valuable has Western history been? Western European history, you know, Euro-American history been? Look at all these achievements that have been accomplished. You know how it may be outweigh those good things outweigh the disadvantages, you know, the harm that other people have experienced in some ways. I mean, I'm starting to see arguments to that extent of let's preserve, let's recognize, and let's not put down the heroes of Western civilization just because of a few bad apples. But it's just, I would say those are good definitions. And white privilege is, I mean, there are other forms of privilege as well. You know, we could talk about male privilege. We could talk about people who have, you know, without disabilities having privilege and things like that. So there are lots of different, and so one of the techniques we've used in some trainings has been to look at earned and unearned advantage, and to have each of us look at that and to say, well, what advantages did you accrue in your life that came to you just by virtue of being born to parents who were married to each other or in a stable home, that kind of thing, to have a college education or any of those kind of things, you know, and what disadvantages came to you for other reasons, things you didn't ask for, you know, didn't ask to be vertically challenged, or you didn't ask to be, you know, to need thick glasses or whatever it might be. But, you know, there are advantages and disadvantages for all of us. And that kind of helps people to put it on on a level playing field too, and to recognize that white privilege is just another example of privilege that a lot of people have and a lot of people are affected by.
I really like that point, Donna, because I do think it helps us in all these comparisons, you know, of seeing different ways of being privileged. Although I understand, you know, white privilege to be so extreme in our society, but these other privileges that you mentioned, you begin to take that inventory of yourself and say, well, how have I been privileged in certain ways? I think about even the term white, you know, when did we become white? I'm not the first to say that, but, you know, I mean, my heritage is French and Native American, and it goes back to France, but we've been here for 350 years, you know, but that's part of my story. It's not that I'm white, but I'm French, and, you know, there's many things about who we are when we begin to dispense with just those quick terminologies and then deepen who we are, our appreciation for our own and where we come from, and then a curiosity for others and exploring that with one another helps to enrich us all.
I want to be mindful of our time, and we have a couple more questions that I want to try and get to in the next couple minutes. But a very simple but profound question that was asked was, why do people become racist? And what can the church be doing in our formation activities to lead people away from racial ideology or having racial biases themselves?
I think everybody would agree that nobody comes here racist. You know, you're certainly not a racist baby. But you may have racist parents, or you may have racist grandparents, or you may have racist friends. And so it's really just a product of one's environment, whether or not a person is going to be racist. And after a while, it becomes a product of a person's choosing, because, you know, a person can grow up. I've met several people actually who've grown up in racist environments and then take it upon themselves to start learning. And a lot of times it's their high school experience or it's their college experience that really puts them on the road of trying to figure out how they became how they are, and they just start talking to others, and it starts to undo the process. But I think that people have to, particularly people who are of European ancestry, need to understand their agency and don't rely on people of color to really educate them about these issues. To realize how much power we each have, you know, just sitting in front of our smartphones or our TV screens or our computer screens, how much free information there is out there and how much we can learn about the truth of American history and how American history has really had embedded in it a system that leans towards and not away from a racist view of society.
I think one thing the church can do, two things the church can do, I think deal with racism in the seminaries. Prepare seminarians who are going to be on the front lines working with people in parishes. Prepare them to work with various cultures of people and to deal with their own biases and upbringing, and to anticipate, prepare to work with a diverse parish. Another thing would be organizations within the church. Your standard ministry organizations or fraternal organizations, you know, deal with the issue of racism there within your group. You know, what has been the history of your organization, and how open have you been to members of other races? Where have you faltered? Where are you trying to make a difference? And then go forward and you know, develop a plan to do that. So I would say, you know, use what's available right now. Use the structures available now.
I want to jump on that and add another dimension to this conversation, which I all agree with. If you look at the pastoral letter, I mean, the bishops really say, you know, where does racism come from? And they actually quote St. Augustine, because we have this lust for dominance. You know, I remember, I don't know why, but for some reason, growing up in Dayton, Ohio, we had negative things. I mean, who were the brunt of our jokes? Well, it was Kentuckians, and of course, my mom was born in Kentucky. So I mean, it wasn't a racial thing; it was a geographic thing. You know, if you're from Ohio, the people who are worse than people from Ohio are people from Kentucky. You know, and I remember that from a very, very early age. And it's just part of the, you know, kind of our fallen humanity. You know, I mean, so in that sense, if we think of racism as a problem or something that's broken, and you say, well, what do we do to fix it? There's something much deeper, and that's one of the reasons I think why the bishops say that all of this begins with a conversion of heart, so that we can open our eyes wider, so we can see the humanity of the person next to us, and see that humanity of the person next to us without any other filters. They're not rich, they're not poor, they're not black, they're not white, they're not educated, they're not uneducated. They're simply a human being, and I'm a human being. And that kind of equality, that kind of recognition of human dignity is really hard for us to do. It's very easy for us to either go one step down or one step up, rather than staying face to face and eye to eye. And even that is a cultural bias, because in some cultures, eye to eye would be offensive. So
the pastoral letter says that racism is a life issue. And I think the more that all of us can keep saying that, the more that I think life is such a core tenet of who we are as Catholics, and valuing of each human person. So that was a really profound sentence in the document. And it also said, you know, when Catholics or anyone else remain unaware of racism or unjust systems of racism, we're ignoring how racism continues to erode the sanctity of life. So for me, that says it all.
I'll just add one thing to that. We need to make sure we're talking about it. The lack of conversation and dialogue, I think, both within our communities and in our churches, and even from the pulpit and from Mass, I think sometimes masks the fact that these feelings and these realities are right before us. And so when we don't talk about it and we don't acknowledge its existence, we definitely allow it to perpetuate in people's hearts and people's minds, and they don't recognize it's an issue. I think especially for young people, the church loses credibility when we don't engage in these conversations, because it is so present and it's so real. And when you're experiencing it or living with it, and you don't hear the church talking about it, it can be very discouraging for many young people, especially young adults. And so I think just naming it, having those conversations, as difficult as they can be, is really, really important. I think another way too is just celebrating our cultures, celebrating the diversity that we have. And it's not about us and them, it's recognizing that we are all us together. That when we celebrate a particular cultural feast day or particular cultures, music and food and traditions, we're celebrating an aspect of who we are as church, who we are as God intended us to be. We have a few other questions, but what I really want to do is just kind of end our time together by acknowledging that this is a continued conversation, and this webinar came from many, many responses and questions and comments that we received. We have many, many other questions that we hope to address in the future, but also a lot of great suggestions for resources and ideas. And so we hope to continue the conversation beyond today. I want to thank all of our panelists, all of our groups here, and everyone who participated today for allowing us to continue this conversation. Also recognizing that we hope in the near future that we will have other ways to be able to engage in this conversation or dialogue. So just one last thing, is there anything else that the panelists would like to share before we sign off?
I guess I would just invite folks to think about one thing, one concrete thing, maybe ordering one of those books, maybe linking on one of, clicking on one of the links that we provide, maybe sharing this with a friend, maybe committing to having a conversation with someone else, maybe just learning more about your own story so you can speak with integrity about who you are and a curiosity about who those are around you, our brothers and sisters of whatever size, shape, color, anything, but just commit in prayer to doing something.
Yeah, I would want to echo what Krisanne said. I mean, and I would recommend that you keep it local. I can't really address the racial tensions in Selma, Alabama, even though I now know a lot about it. but I can do something here in my parish and in my neighborhood. And so the question becomes, how do I begin to act locally with an awareness of how this disease, if you will, has infected our whole society?
Well, on behalf of the panel, on behalf of all of the organizations who have to co-sponsor this, we thank you for joining us for this webinar today, and we hope you engage us with us in the future. We'll be happy to send out those resources that we've shared over the last few days, and really would appreciate your feedback. So thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and God bless.
God bless you.
Bye.